The first story, The Forgotten Ward. It was a Halloween like no other. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie pallor over the town of Everwood. The air was heavy with the scent of fallen leaves, and the distant howl of the wind sent shivers down my spine. With the promise of spooky tales and haunted houses, I set out for an unforgettable night with my friends that we had heard whispers of an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, known as the Everwood Asylum for the Criminally Insane. The asylum had been shuttered for decades, its dark history buried beneath layers of overgrown ivy and urban legends. It was said to be a place where the most deranged and dangerous minds had been confined, hidden from the world's prying eyes. The group consisted of 4 of us, Mark, the fearless leader who had a penchant for daring exploits, Sarah, the curious and adventurous soul who had suggested the asylum as our Halloween destination, and Jason, the joker who always had a knack for turning the creepiest moments into comic relief. We arrived at the crumbling gates of the asylum, the wrought iron twisted and rusted with age. A sign, almost illegible, declared the place off limits, but we had come too far to turn back. Armed with flashlights and cameras, we squeezed through a gap in the gate and ventured into the sprawling, overgrown courtyard. The asylum loomed before us, a decaying monstrosity of brick and stone, its windows like blank, staring eyes. The wind whispered through the ivy-covered walls, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. We decided to split up to explore the building further, Mark and Jason heading one way and Sarah and I taking another. As we stepped inside, the air turned dank and cold, sending a shiver through my spine. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, and the echoing of our footsteps felt like a drumroll to some unseen performance. We entered the first room we encountered, and I was struck by the eerie stillness. The room was small, barely enough to fit a narrow bed and a small table. Faded drawings adorned the cracked walls, revealing the work of a tormented artist. A journal lay open on the table, filled with incoherent scribbles and chilling sketches of grotesque figures. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stepped into the domain of someone deeply disturbed. Sarah's flashlight fell on a faded newspaper article that had been taped to the wall. It told the story of a fire that had consumed the asylum years ago, killing several inmates and staff. The blaze had been declared an accident, but the survivors had always whispered about something more sinister. The article included a photograph of the head nurse, a stern woman named Matilda Gray, who had perished in the flames. We continued our exploration, our footsteps echoing through the corridors. The further we delved, the more the asylum seemed to come alive. Whispered voices reached our ears, and fleeting shadows danced at the periphery of our vision. I tried to pass them off as tricks of the imagination, but Sarah's wide eyes told me she was experiencing the same phenomena. We arrived at the Forgotten Ward, a section of the asylum that had been sealed off from the rest. The door was heavy, and it took both of us to push it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the dim light revealed the desperate state of the room's inhabitants. The walls were covered in frantic scratches and desperate pleas for help. In one corner, I noticed a figure, huddled and motionless. It was a man, his tattered clothes barely hanging on his skeletal frame. His eyes were vacant, and he muttered to himself incoherently. Sarah and I approached cautiously, our concern outweighing our fear. We tried to speak to him, but his words were gibberish, a twisted stream of consciousness that made no sense. He rocked back and forth, his bony fingers clutching at his filthy hair. I felt a shiver of dread as I realized the truth. This man had been forgotten, left to wither away in this forsaken place. The Forgotten Ward was a tomb for those deemed beyond help, where the most deranged minds had been left to our fate. As we backed away from the man, I spotted a door at the far end of the ward. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out from within. We approached it cautiously, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Inside, we discovered a small office that had remained untouched by time. The room was dominated by a desk, behind which sat a dusty, old chair. On the desk lay a collection of journals, each one filled with the meticulous notes of Matilda Gray, the head nurse. We began to read, and the horrifying truth of the asylum began to unravel before us. Matilda Gray had been more than just a nurse. She had been conducting sinister experiments on the inmates, pushing their fragile minds to the brink. Her journals chronicled the torment she had inflicted upon them, the inhumane treatments and the cruel punishments. The man in the corner had once been a brilliant composer, driven to madness by Matilda's cruel experiments on his mind. The forgotten ward was filled with stories of torment and despair, all at the hands of the asylum staff. As we read, the air grew colder, and the room seemed to come alive with the voices of the tormented souls who had suffered within these walls. We could feel their pain, their anger, and their desperation. It was as if the asylum itself was a living entity, holding the memories of the past within its decaying walls. We hurriedly collected the journals, determined to expose the horrors of the asylum. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. We were trapped, the room descending into darkness as our flashlights flickered and died. In the pitch-black darkness, we could hear the whispers growing louder, the cries of the tormented souls closing in on us. We fumbled for the door, our panic rising as we realized we were not alone in the room. Something was with us, something malevolent and vengeful. The ghostly figure of Matilda Gray appeared before us, her eyes filled with a hatred that transcended the grave. She was not alone. The tormented souls of the forgotten ward had risen, their anger and suffering manifesting as a spectral horde that swirled around us. We screamed, our voices lost in the cacophony of the damned. The room seemed to warp and shift, the walls closing in around us. The apparitions grew closer, their icy fingers reaching out to touch us. We were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the vengeful spirits of the asylum's past. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped. The room returned to its eerie stillness, the malevolent presence fading away. The door creaked open, and we stumbled out into the corridor, gasping for breath. We fled the asylum, our hearts pounding with terror. The horrors we had witnessed were beyond anything we could have imagined. The forgotten ward was a place of unspeakable suffering, and the spirits of the past had made sure we knew their pain. As we left the asylum behind, we vowed to expose its dark secrets to the world. The ghosts of the past had shown us the true horror that had unfolded within those decaying walls, and we could not let their stories be forgotten. Halloween had transformed from a night of thrilling scares to a night of true terror, and the memories of that forsaken place would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The second story, The Haunting of Hollow Hill. The chill of October was settling in as Halloween approached, and a sense of anticipation filled the small town of Hollow Hill. The town had always been known for its eerie atmosphere, surrounded by ancient forests and a history shrouded in mystery. It was the kind of place where ghost stories were born, and I was about to become a part of one. On the eve of Halloween, I received a peculiar letter in the mail. The envelope was made of old, brittle parchment, and the address was written in elaborate, archaic script. It read, Hollow Hill Manor, a night to remember. There was no return address. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the envelope to find an invitation to a grand Halloween masquerade at Hollow Hill Manor, a mansion perched atop a hill that had always been rumored to be haunted. The invitation itself was equally strange, with a skull and crossbones emblem and the message, "Come, and let the spirits guide you." I knew it was unconventional, perhaps even foolish, to accept an invitation from an unknown sender to an allegedly haunted mansion, but Halloween was my favorite time of the year. The idea of a masquerade in such a spooky setting was too intriguing to resist. So, I dusted off my old tuxedo and set out for the event. When I arrived at Hollow Hill Manor on Halloween night, I was met with a sight that left me speechless. The mansion was a grand, Victorian-era structure, its towering spires and turrets silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The gardens were overgrown with ivy, and the winding path leading to the entrance was lined with flickering lanterns. The air was crisp, and a full moon cast an eerie glow over the entire scene. As I entered the mansion, I was greeted by a butler in a tuxedo, his face obscured by an ornate Venetian mask. He handed me a mask of my own, a macabre design of a skeletal face. The grand hall was adorned with cobwebs, and the walls were lined with antique portraits, each figure's eyes seeming to follow my every move. The other guests, all in elaborate costumes and masks, mingled in the hall. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of excitement, and I felt a strange, almost otherworldly energy in the air. It was as if the mansion itself had come to life for this special night. The clock struck midnight, and a hush fell over the crowd. The host, a tall, imposing figure in a crimson cloak, stepped forward. He welcomed us to the masquerade and explained that the evening would be filled with games, surprises, and a grand feast in the dining hall. The guests eagerly followed his lead, their masks concealing their expressions. That I decided to explore the mansion, and as I ventured into the dimly lit corridors, I realized that Hollow Hill Manor was even more mysterious on the inside. The walls were adorned with ancient tapestries, and the rooms were filled with antique furniture. There was a sense of timelessness about the place, as if it existed in a realm all its own. As I made my way through the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as though unseen eyes followed my every move, and the sensation grew stronger the deeper I ventured into the mansion's labyrinthine interior. That I entered a room at the end of a long corridor, and there, I found an ornate mirror. The glass was clouded and ancient, but as I looked into it, I saw a figure standing behind me in the reflection. It was a woman in a flowing, white gown, her face hidden behind a mask. I turned around, but there was no one there. Shaken, I continued my exploration, encountering more and more guests who seemed to appear and disappear like phantoms. It was as though the mansion held a secret, and I was determined to uncover it. That I eventually made my way to the dining hall, where a grand feast was set before the guests. The tables were adorned with silver candelabras and goblets, and the food was a sumptuous display of gourmet cuisine. The host raised his glass and proposed a toast to the spirits that watched over Hollow Hill Manor. The guests eagerly began to eat, but as I took my first bite, I realized that something was amiss. The food was delicious, but it had an otherworldly quality, as if it were not of this realm. I looked around and saw that the other guests were in a trance, their movements slow and deliberate as they continued to eat. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I pushed my plate away, realizing that I had fallen under some sort of enchantment. I needed to escape this bizarre masquerade before it was too late. That I made my way to the grand hall and spotted a grand clock, its pendulum swinging in a hypnotic rhythm. The host approached me, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. He spoke of a grand game that would take place in the mansion's darkened corridors, a game that would test the courage and wit of the guests. Without my consent, the host placed a mask on my face, obscuring my vision. I was led into the corridor, and the game began. In the darkness, I could hear the whispers of the other guests, their voices filled with a strange desperation. It became clear that this was no ordinary game but a test of survival, a nightmarish trial orchestrated by the host. As I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, I encountered eerie obstacles and puzzles that challenged both my wits and my bravery. Ghostly figures appeared and vanished, their laughter echoing in the shadows. It felt as though the very walls of the mansion were closing in on me, and the air grew colder with each passing moment. The game continued for what felt like an eternity, and I was plagued by a growing sense of dread. The other guests had vanished into the darkness, and I was left to confront the horrors of Hollow Hill Manor alone. As I rounded a corner, I came face to face with the woman I had seen in the mirror earlier. She stood before me, her mask concealing her expression. In a hushed voice, she warned me to escape while I still could, for the mansion was a trap, a place where the spirits of the past were bound to a never-ending cycle of torment. Desperation overcame me, and I pushed forward, determined to find a way out of this nightmarish ordeal. The game seemed to reach its climax when I entered a room bathed in an eerie, crimson light. At its center stood a grand mirror, and in its reflection, I saw the host, his mask concealing a malevolent grin. With a sudden surge of willpower, I removed the mask from my face and shattered it on the ground. The enchantment lifted, and I was free from the host's control. The mansion around me began to crumble, and the ghostly figures faded into nothingness. I fled the crumbling Hollow Hill Manor, the grand clock chiming its final toll as I crossed the threshold. The mansion collapsed behind me, disappearing into the night. I was left standing alone in the moonlit gardens, the echoes of the night's horrors still fresh in my mind. As I walked away from the hill, I couldn't help but wonder if the mansion had truly vanished or if it still existed in some hidden corner of reality. Hollow Hill Manor had been a place of mystery, enchantment, and unspeakable terror, and I had survived to tell the tale. Halloween had transformed from a night of thrilling scares into a night of true horror, and I would forever carry the memory of that fateful masquerade with me, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we dare to imagine.